Hey there. This video lecture is on using presentational aids in your speech. As you know by now, to fulfill the requirements of the informative speech, you have to use at least one presentational aid in your speech. So this will be a good tutorial on how to incorporate those into your presentations. But one of the things I like to do is begin with a funny kind of little video on the use of PowerPoint. So we'll take a look at this and I'll come back to our tutorial after this.
Well, what I tell people all the time, this is how we communicate in today's world, okay? This is what we don't want. This is typically called life or death by PowerPoint, right? We think in PowerPoint now. This is a true story. I was driving through Colorado a couple years ago. I hit a patch of ice on I-70 coming out of the Eisenhower Tunnel, going like, 65, 70, maybe 90 miles an hour. And I started spinning at top speed, and my life flashed before my eyes, and I swear to you, it was in PowerPoint. And how bad has PowerPoint got? This is actually the number of PowerPoint presentations per day. Look at that. It's 43 million per day in 2007, 54 million in 2008, 69 million this year, 88 million per day next year. Now, I looked at this chart. Look, that is growing exponentially. I looked at this chart. Here's home foreclosures for a year. You see, that's growing about the same way. I realized that PowerPoint actually caused the mortgage meltdown. So this is a thing I do called life after death by PowerPoint. Basically, don't do these things with PowerPoint. These are the things that people do that drive me nuts. And the only way to show them not to do this is to show them what not to do. So the biggest one I see, the most common PowerPoint thing, number one, people tend to put every word they're going to say on their PowerPoint slide. Although this eliminates the need to memorize your talk, ultimately makes your slides crowded, wordy, and boring. You lose your audience attention before you even reach the bottom of your first slide. Second most common, font size is important. Size matters. Too small, and that's not good for anybody. On the other hand, too big, and you're looking like a moron. You just look like an idiot. Don't have your fonts moving. Keep your text stationary. There's nothing more annoying than text that does it. Blinking, don't have it blinking. Don't have it spinning. Don't have stuff flying around the screen. You drive people with ADD crazy. They're just like, oh, what's happening? Oh. Now, since I'm talking about fonts, people are really into fonts. I've noticed this. By the way, this is one of the best jokes that I know. Comic Sans and Helvetica walk into a bar. And ask the bartender for a drink. And the bartender says, sorry, we don't serve your type here. That kills at a font convention, guys. Oh, that's a good one. It's a type. I get it. The font you choose, be very careful. Everybody has their favorite font. The font you choose sends a message about who you are as a person. There's a long list of fonts. We pick one. That reflects our personality. We're sending an unspoken message. So, for example, if you choose Carrier New, it means you're organized and structured, and like you pretend you're still using a typewriter. If you choose Comic Sans, it means you think you're funny. And if you choose Times New Roman, it means you're lazy, apathetic, and unimaginative, and you always use the default. If you choose Georgia, it means you speak with a southern accent. If you choose Ariel, it means you like the Little Mermaid. Oh, a lot of Ariel people. If you choose Old English, it means you enjoy malt liquor. Didn't know this. Did you know this? We got a few more. Helvetica, that means you're a mayonnaise lover. That's a stretch. I'll admit that is a stretch. Blackadder, that means you're an African-American accountant. That one requires some thought. Sorry. And if you like wingdings, it means you're a nerd and you have no life. Now, if you type in all small letters, some people do that, all small letters, that means you're quiet, shy, and unassertive. If you type in all capital letters, that means you yell a lot. There's somebody over there. If you type small letters followed by capital letters, it means your caps lock is stock on. Don't you hate when that happens? Usually going along for a while, you look up, oh, darn! And then finally, if you have a mix of capital letters and small letters, that means this is a ransom note and you are a kidnapper. Very hard to do, by the way. The fourth most common PowerPoint mistake, avoid excessive bullet pointing, only bullet key points. too many bullet points, and your key messages will not stand out. In fact, the term bullet point comes from people firing guns at annoying presenters. This slide, by the way, has crashed PowerPoint. Apparently, there's a max about how many bullet points you can have, and I crashed it. The other thing you can do is have animations. People love animations. They have stuff going, zooming in and out and left and right. You get seasick watching some of these. And it turns out if you're a visual learner, your effectiveness as a speaker will go up with the more animations. But if they're easily distracted, they are not even paying attention to what you're saying. They're just watching the cool stuff. And there's regions to this graph. There's the simple but effective region, the active but confusing, the effective but boring, the active but ineffective, the dull but static region, the busy but useless region over there, the ADD only region there up in the corner, the useful musing, the stupid confusing, the dull triangle, the hyper triangle, the sleepy square, the dizzying pentagon, and then everything else is just grouped into what's called pointless motion. This one slide, by the way, took me 3.5 weeks to make. Sure, PowerPoint can suck the life out of you. Now, one of the biggest dangers today, and I'm telling you, I hear it more and more every time I hear a conversation, is what I call SAOD, or Severe Acronym Overload Disorder. Have you heard people talk recently? There are no words going between, yeah, I IM'd my CFO about our ROI and our CRM and our RRP, and it turns out our EPS is really SOL, so we better do something ASAP. Like, can I buy a vowel? I can't solve your conversation. And I made up this resume, but this could be a real resume in today's world. Look, I got an MBA from USC, an MSEE from MIT, a BSEE from DU. I worked at IBM, HP, VLSI. I'm a member of IEEE, EIT, NCAA, NAACP, AARP, AAA. I want a position as CEO, COO, CFO, CIO, CTO, CMO, CSO, CPO, CYO, VP, EVP, or EIEIO. I want to be the EIEIO of a company someday. That's actually my dream. Hi, I'm the EIEIO. Nice to meet you. Call me old McDonald, that's all right. Now, kind of my final point, and this people do all the time, is they'll just have graph after graph just to impress you with their graph prowess. And I chose acronym usage. This is my real-time acronym usage. It pretty much goes up and down. I don't know why you need the graph, but you can see pretty much peak there. I'll use some more acronyms later. And there's just a chart that doesn't make any sense to you, but I just want to impress you. Here's an acronym letter distribution. C's, I's, E's, N's, and S's are the most common letters that I use in my acronyms. Here's a pie chart letter distribution. And here's, I have no idea what you use that for, but you can generate that automatically in PowerPoint. So I figured what the heck I did. Here's a line graph, the number of line graphs throughout my show. Here's a bar chart, number of bar charts, pretty much goes up and down. Here's a real bar chart. There's beer, wine, martini. That's the kind of bar chart I'm into. Here's a candy bar chart. Here's a salad bar chart, tomatoes, sprouts, spinach, and the different calories of each. Here's a sushi bar chart. This is a probability of illness, depending on what your favorite. There's a lot of detail in my act. Please pay close attention. Here's a bar chart of the number of bars, visits versus age throughout my life. Most people don't take the time to do this, but you can see when I was 17, I had the fake ID, so it was confiscated when I was 19, and my bar usage dropped dramatically. I spent way too long making these charts. When I was 21, I went nearly every day of the year. You can see it was about 342. It's kind of gone down through the years. I plan to drink a lot when I'm 40, a lot when I'm 50, and then retire and drink constantly. That's my plan. Thank you. Here's a spreadsheet of spreadsheets. Getting back to the charts. Here's a spreadsheet of spreads. Butter, margarine, I can't believe it's not butter. Mayonnaise, French onion, cheese whiz, and Patriots plus 5 over Colts. Every possible spread you could imagine. Here's an org chart of org charts. Here's my main org chart, my sales, marketing, engineering org chart. Here's your reorg chart. Every company should have those. And then this is interesting. This is my actual family org chart. Make one of these. It's important. Steve, our cat, runs our family. If you have a cat, you know that is true. Any animal that goes, hey, I just pooped in there, somebody clean that up. Clearly head of the family. My wife, Laura, reports to Steve. I report to my wife, and the remote control reports to me. That's it. That's my entire region of domain right there. Back to the charts again. Here's a pie chart of chart types, 3D charts, bar charts, pie charts. Here's a pie chart of pies for dessert, lemon, pumpkin, cherry, pecan, apple. Here's a pizza pie chart. Here's your pot pie chart. There's a better pot pie chart. Here's a pie chart with values of pi for the nerds out there. You got 3.14159, 22.7, 3.14, and pi itself. We have a pie chart. I was thinking, why don't we have a cake chart? So there's a cake chart. Why do we leave the cake out? There's a birthday cake chart. There's a wedding cake chart. There's a bundt cake chart. an upside-down cake chart, and then really that's an upside-down cake chart. And all right, I think I've covered all the charts. Any questions at this point?
Okay, so I think that's kind of a fun way to let me see what's. So that's a fun way to kind of open this little video lecture. It illustrates all the things that drive me crazy about PowerPoint, overuse of bulleting, overuse of information. So that's what we're going to do in this lecture video is we're going to talk about some of the guidelines for producing a really good PowerPoint presentation. So our objectives for this lecture are we're going to talk about the 5 benefits of using presentational aids in speeches, and then we're going to talk about the strategies for using presentational aids effectively before and during a speech. So the first thing we want to understand is that presentational aids increase message clarity. They give your audience a chance to visualize a message. This is also one of the things you want to keep in mind. Ask yourself, does my audience need this presentational aid in order to get the idea across, in order to understand it? Don't just put a presentational aid up for the sake of putting it up. And make sure that it actually helps your audience visualize the message. It may also reinforce your message. It adds a sensory participation. Research tells us that we tend to remember more when we see something versus reading it alone. And when you add the visual component to something, you increase the likelihood that they're going to retain that information. It also increases your speaker dynamism. When you have to interact with a PowerPoint presentation, it creates your delivery persona. It forces, excuse me, for you to interact with the PowerPoint and vary your sort of delivery presence. You kind of have to, engage the PowerPoint, explain it to the audience. So these are all helpful ways that your presentational aids will work in your speeches. It also enhances your speaker confidence. This enhances your clarity and the impact of your message. If you can show a visual component that enhances the verbal, that's going to make your confidence even higher, and it promotes your movement. So you have to kind of walk and process and pull the PowerPoint into your presentation. It gives you enhanced speaker credibility and improves your delivery and your impact. When you are showing a visual illustration of a concept, that makes your credibility even stronger. It helps the audience say, "Oh, I get this. You've gone an extra step to help me understand this concept." So tips for preparing presentational slides. The first is to use a white or a neutral background, kind of like I'm using in this video lecture. Make sure that you are professional. Remember, spelling and grammar matter. One of the biggest challenges I have are students who will put a PowerPoint together at the very last minute, and then when they pull it up in class to deliver the speech, or they're doing it in their uploaded presentation, there's always a spelling and grammar error. Nothing can damage your credibility more, especially if this is being done in front of an audience of people who are professional and who expect professionalism. Make sure you're also using correct graphs. Make sure your pie chart adds up to 100%. Make sure you're using a line graph to show statistical trends. Make sure there's only one idea per visual slide. Your audience should be able to understand your slide in about 15 to 30 seconds. As our little, comedy video showed, when the more information you have on that slide, the longer it's going to take your audience to understand it. So you want to get that slide up, you want to process it, and then it goes away. This means no more than about 4 to 6 pieces of information on that slide. More than 4 to 6 pieces, you're not going to be able to cover that in the 15 to 30 seconds that it's going to be up there. Consider using block letters for your text and dark colors. Make sure your fonts, he talks a lot about fonts that are sans serif. This font, for example, is sans serif. It doesn't have the little edges on the fonts, the little what we call serifs, which are the little scrolls and things that are on each letter. So use something that is what we call sans serif, and make sure your colors are very dark, something that can be seen from all sides of the room. Use color sparingly. Don't make all your letters a different color, but use color in a way that you can say in your speech, if you look at this green pie piece, if you look at this blue pie piece, your audience knows exactly where to look. Avoid extraneous detail. We don't need clip art. Unless the clip art adds to your presentation, don't throw clip art in. Borders. We don't need all kinds of unnecessary borders. Your audience wants to look at that presentational aid and see exactly what information you want to convey to them. One of the biggest challenges with PowerPoint, make it large enough for everyone to see from all sides of the room. If you're only putting 4 to 6 pieces of information on a slide, then there should be plenty of room for you to make those PowerPoint letters as large as they can. I think your text talks about 36-point font. Err on the side of going bigger rather than smaller. Ask yourself, is this slide essential to understanding the message? Do I need this presentational aid for this message to come across? If not, then don't use it. PowerPoint should only exist to help your audience understand a concept better than you can do by words alone. If your words alone are enough. For example, if I'm going to talk about dogs and my PowerPoint slide is a picture of a dog, I've done nothing to clarify what a dog looks like. My audience already knows that. But if I'm going to talk about different breeds of dogs that make the best service dogs, I might show pictures of different breeds of dogs to give the audience an idea of which breed is different or how different each breed is. Now, those pictures will help to clarify. So when I'm grading your presentational aids, that's what I'm going to be asking myself. Did you need this presentational aid to get the point across? So let's talk about the types of presentational aids. Because you're doing a PowerPoint presentation, you need to make sure that you're using one of these 5 different types of presentational aids. So we're going to split these up into different categories. The first thing we're going to talk about are pictures and diagrams. Make sure your pictures are proper size, that they're large enough and that they're clear. Make sure they're necessary to help you clarify the message. You can download pictures from the internet, from Google Slides, from Prezi, any of those kinds of picture presentation software programs. You can get them from the Google Images on a Google search. Diagrams, same thing. You can simplify and exaggerate key points. They simplify information for your audience. I would never want to show like the engine of a car, a photograph of an engine of a car. A diagram might look better. Make sure your diagrams are simple and easy to read, and make sure all your labels are large enough. So what I'm going to do is show you some sample pictures and diagrams. These come from actual speeches that were given in my class. Some of these are good and some of these are not so good, and we're going to talk about what makes these an effective or an ineffective presentational aid. This first one was on a speech, persuasive speech, asking us to change the warning labels on cigarette packages. So in the United States, for example, we see the Surgeon General warning. In Canada, if you buy a pack of cigarettes, there's a picture that says tobacco smoke hurts babies. They also showed a second one that showed 2 other types of pictures that appear on a cigarette package in Canada. I think this is an effective use of pictures. You couldn't give your speech without showing these pictures because it would be really hard to describe these to an audience. So I think in this case, pictures work really well. This was a speech that a student gave on the methamphetamine epidemic. This came from a website called The Faces of Meth. This was a woman before she became addicted to methamphetamine. This was her mugshot. And this is the same woman about 5 years later. So it shows the devastating impact that meth can have on the body. Again, without these pictures, it would have been really almost impossible for this speaker to have conveyed the change in this person's appearance. So in this case, yes, picture works really, really well. This was a person who talked about the Eiffel Tower, how the Eiffel Tower was built, why it was built, etc., etc. But they considered the fact that if the audience maybe can recognize the Eiffel Tower, they may not have a good sense of how tall the Eiffel Tower is. So they added this companion presentational aid to show how tall the Eiffel Tower is in comparison to some other iconic monuments or buildings. And I thought this was really effective. I like that they took two presentational aids to kind of clarify those. So this is, again, a great example of that. Here's a good example of a picture gone horribly wrong. This was a speech on animal cruelty. This was a story about a scientist who in the 1950s grafted the head of one dog onto the body of another, and they lived for a while before they had to euthanize it. The problem here is your audience is going to want to be reading that article. So the best way to use this would be to get rid of all that text, blow up the picture so the picture is the only image that your audience is seeing. Here's a good example of a speech. This was on the anthrax skin epidemic that happened a few years ago. And what they wanted to do was talk about the fact that many people were running into the emergency room and complaining that they had this skin form of anthrax because they had a little pimple. And this speech was telling us that unless your pimple looks like this, a lesion on your skin, you don't have, the anthrax. So this is tough to look at, but hard to give this speech if you didn't have that picture to clarify. Let's talk about diagrams. This is a diagram of the Earth's crust. So they do it in sort of a three-dimensional way. Notice there's only 4 labels here. On a large screen, those labels would be big enough for everybody to see, and I think this is a really effective way of showing the Earth's crust. Here's a good example of somebody wanting to show the difference between plaques in the brain of somebody who has a normal brain versus a brain that has Alzheimer's. And again, I love this side-by-side comparison. You can find just about any kind of diagram on the internet and upload it. Just a handful of labels here. This was a student who was doing a speech on prosthetic devices, and they were talking about kind of the evolution of prosthetic devices, and they found this black and white diagram, and then they were able to color in the parts that they wanted us to look at. Again, only about 6 labels here, but I think this is really effective. It's simple, it's easy. If you can create your own presentational aid, you're a good artist. I think that's the way to go. This is an example of a diagram that's terrible. This has way too much information. This is on the art of reflexology. This says there are these pressure points in your feet that can affect some of the organs in your body. So again, just because you found a diagram on the internet and you upload it does not make it effective. If you're looking at a visual and realizing that this audience is going to need a good 2 minutes to figure this out, then it is not an effective presentational aid. Here's a good example of somebody who isn't a good artist. This was a picture of a volcano, or at least a drawing of a volcano. Again, this is a person who either did not want to attempt to find a diagram of a volcano, but they created one themselves. As you can tell, really ineffective and amateurish. Here's an example of a diagram that violates almost all of our expectations. It's way too much information. It's confusing. We have no idea where to look. Way much more than about 6 pieces of information on this. This probably should have been simplified. This could have been redone in a much more effective way. But again, don't just look for a diagram on the internet and upload it, because this is a failure. Again, somebody who didn't have the diagram they were looking for, so they decided to do something on their own. They created this, I don't know what to call it. I don't even remember what this speech was about, but this presentational aid was so bad I had to keep it. But again, just violate. It's not professional. It doesn't clarify or enhance anything. I have no idea what that little sun up in the corner is for. And, make sure everything on your presentational aid has a purpose. So again, this is an example of a not so good diagram. There's way too much information on here. I don't think you're going to cover all of these parts of the speech mechanism. So edit this out. Control this. This should have been pared down to just 2 or 3 labels. Maybe highlight the parts that you want your audience to look at. Here's a good example of if you're going to talk about a sensitive topic like breast surgeries, a diagram works really well. The problem here is there's way too much information on this. This should have been divided into 3 separate slides, get rid of all that text, and just use the diagrams. So the diagrams here work well to talk about something sensitive, but this is way too much information. Split this up into 3 parts and get rid of all that text. So those are diagrams and pictures. Those are certainly an option for you to choose for your presentational aids. The next 2 we're going to talk about are maps and charts. Maps should highlight a specific area of focus for your audience. I say this in my face-to-face lectures all the time. We are an incredibly geographically illiterate society. Put a map of the United States up without any of the names of the states on them and ask somebody to show you where Ohio is, or Montana, or North Dakota, and they'll be at a loss. Let alone the Middle East or Africa. There are people who still think Africa is a country. So maps, anytime you are using a reference in your speech to a location, maps can be really helpful, but make sure they're simple and easy to understand. Charts, same thing. I will tell you right now that the #1 visual aid I grade down for are people who use charts. Charts should only be used to give your audience information in a way that you can reveal it one item at a time. So you may want to use some animation in this. Charts work that way. I have a lot of people who will say, oh, I can't think of anything to do my presentational aid on, so their chart is just a list of their main points, which doesn't enhance or clarify their message in any way, shape, or form. So let's look at some examples. Again, these come from actual student speeches. Some are good, some are bad. So this is a speech on the theory of continental drift. This is the theory that at one point all of the continents in the world were one big continent, and then over billions of years they drifted apart. I think this is a great map. I think it shows exactly what that theory was all about. I don't think you could do this speech without that map and have it make as much sense. This was a speech on the Columbia River Gorge trails. They just wanted to show where a couple of the trails were. So in this case, you have Horsetail Falls and Multnomah Falls, and they just wanted to give you some perspective. Where is it in relation to I-5 and I-84? I think this is really effective. You'd want something simple and easy to understand. This is a speech on the former Yugoslavia that was divided up into the states, the Baltic states. Again, simple, easy to understand. There's a lot of information on here, but because it's a map, you are going to have to deal with some extra labels on here. But I love the use of color. I think this is really effective. This was also a speech on Saudi Arabia. So they wanted to show a map of the world, and then they kind of pulled out and enlarged the country of Saudi Arabia to show just how big it is in relation to other countries and where it is in perspective of the entire world. This works only if the country is large enough for that to make sense. You couldn't do this with a country like Kuwait or something along those lines. This is a speech on the 2000 election. This was to show how the Electoral College divided up between Al Gore and George Bush. Again, I think this is simple, easy to understand. This again is a great map to show you that if you were to ask somebody to point on here where Illinois or Montana or Wyoming is, they would have a difficult time. But again, maps put things in perspective for us. Graphs. Graphs are a great opportunity for you to show statistical trends, percentages. There are 3 types of graphs that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a line graph, we're going to talk about a pie or circle graph, and a bar graph. Each type of graph can only show a specific kind of information. So line graphs can only show statistical trends. Pie charts or pie graphs can only show percentages, relationship between the part and the whole. And bar graphs can only show statistical comparisons. So when I talked about professionalism and accuracy, I meant that make sure you're using the correct graph for the correct statistic or piece of information. So we're going to take a look at some of these. Again, these come from actual student speeches. So this was a pie graph that shows U.S. energy consumption. So they wanted to show out of all of the energy sources, what's the breakdown. And this uses a pie graph in a way that helps you to understand how that is broken down. Bar graphs do the same thing. This is about U.S. Renewable energy consumption. What bar graphs do is show statistical comparisons. Line graphs show statistical trends. So if you were showing voting trends in this student government election, this is what a line graph would look like. So these are 3 examples. These aren't from student speeches, by the way. These were from the textbook instructor manual. So let's take a look at some of these. This was a speech talking about learning disabilities in prison. And there are a couple of things I have issues with in this presentation. The first is the title, Percentage of Prisoners with Learning Disabilities. Makes it seem like each of these levels of education is a learning disability. And so you want to be careful of that. Second, I think the colors are a little hard to discern. If you were saying to your audience, look at the purple, but look at the maroon, they might have a difficult time. So maybe use some green and red and blue and yellow to kind of highlight these. The last thing is if you can run a spell check on this, diplomat is a word, but you really want it to say high school diploma. So you've really got to, use your editing skills on this. A little bit of irony in this one. This is an example about of all students enrolled at Clark in this particular year, how many withdrew, how many failed. And then the blue piece represents how many were successful. Except if you look very carefully, the word successful is misspelled. If you want to misspell anything on a pie chart, you don't want to misspell the word successful. It basically says you're not one of those 70%. You're probably one of these 13% that failed. So your credibility can be hurt very well. And a spell check would have taken like a millionth of a second on this pie chart. This is another good example of a pie chart gone horribly wrong. Remember, we are only using pie charts that represent parts to the whole, and I kind of cut off the key here, but this blue part represents Kansas. The yellow part represents the United States, and you'll notice Kansas is larger than the United States. You never have a pie piece that's actually a subset of one of the other pie pieces. And this, if I had shown you the key on here, is actually Nebraska instead of Nebraska. So another spelling error. But this just fails on every level. This, you can't have a variable as a pie piece. So I show you this just simply because it's easy to say, make a pie chart, tell your computer to make a pie chart, but you've got to make sure it's accurately presented. It's another winner. This purports to show 20% of people who take this psychological exam pass. The actual image here, however, represents 25%. So again, you can damage your credibility if you are not using these charts in an effective way. This is a bar graph, and I show this in class, and this is probably the one that gets the biggest laughs when we do my presentational aid critiques. If we look at the title here, American Soldiers Fying in World War II. So clearly they're not fying, it's meant fighting. And if we look down here, we see that it's actually men versus women. So it makes it sound like men were fighting women. And it looks like there was only one woman, or if we look at the key, it's actually a WOM. So we've got one WOM fighting against 150 or 15 million men. Fails on so many different levels. One, I don't think this should have been a bar graph. Run a spell check. WOM is not a word. Fying is not a word. Men weren't fighting women in World War II. This was showing how many women enlisted versus the number of men who enlisted. Use your charts and your graphs effectively. They have to actually do what you hope they are meant to do, and this does not do that. This is another example of a pie chart gone wrong. Remember, pie charts can only show percentages or parts to the whole. This, one, the title suggests you can drop out of prison. Second, you've got two pieces of data here that's being measured. You've got 49% of prisoners are dropouts. We don't know dropout of what, high school, college, beauty school. And then you have 24% of public who are dropouts. You can't combine these into a pie chart. this would probably need to be two separate pie charts. Out of all prisoners, how many are dropouts? Out of all the public, how many are dropouts? So it's important that we consider these pie charts, that they need to be correct. Again, you can tell your computer to make a pie chart. This is not. This has to add up to 100% because it's percentage. This is an example of a line graph. And this is a person who wanted to show how quickly Enron stock devalued once the Enron scandal had happened. And so they showed this huge, quick decline within those 18 months. But then they wanted to kind of give perspective on this, assuming that audiences may not understand the concept of, Enron's, the stock market. So they showed this comparison. They said, look, if you had 1,000 shares when Enron stock was at its highest, you would have had enough money to buy a 2002 Mercedes S500. Once all that stock devalued, 1,000 shares would now be only worth 25 cents, and that's enough to buy a K2 mountain bike. So the idea of showing that comparison, that, before the stock, collapsed, you had a lot of money. After, you didn't have as much money, and I'm going to show you what you could have bought with each of those. So let's look at charts. And charts, again, are an excellent way for you to show information. In this case, this is the top countries for internet use. I think there's a lot going on here. I would get rid of that kind of clip art in the back, but notice it's really simple. China is 21%, India 13.5%, United States 8.4%. So I think this is really effective. This was a great speech on the use of a job interview, what to bring to a job interview. And as you saw, each of those came in one at a time. So if you're going to do a chart, one of the things you can do is control that information. So if you create an animation, you can explain that as you are talking about it. This might work for a timeline if you're trying to use a PowerPoint slide to show a timeline. So I saved this. This was actually from a student speech, and I really liked that. And then, there were a couple more. Okay, here's a good example of a chart. This is blood alcohol levels, depending on your body weight. Again, your audience is going to look at this and not know where to look, how to, approach this. So you don't just copy a chart from a book and put it up. Remember, charts that you can read on the internet or on a website, you can ponder them and look over them for quite a while. For your audience, they're only going to get 15 to 30 seconds on this. Again, way too much information. This chart makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so let's talk about the actual use of presentational aids in your speech. Because we're online, we're not going to be able to use PowerPoint in your speech. You're actually going to upload your PowerPoint presentation into a separate link, and then I'm going to have that presentation up while you are speaking. So, but if you're giving a PowerPoint presentation to a real audience, there are several things you want to consider. The first is, when we have PowerPoint up, there's a risk of the speaker narrating that information. Again, put only bullet points and put as little information on there, so you have to fill in the gaps. The speech is about you, so you should be the one explaining the one sort of bullet point. It limits imagination and connection. If you are portraying everything on a PowerPoint slide, you're giving your audience no opportunity to kind of create their own images and ideas, and they'll have a difficult time connecting with you as a speaker. So we want to limit our use of presentational aids. When I teach in face-to-face, I don't use PowerPoints that often because I really want the class to connect with me and have me be the focal point of the lectures. Display tips. Clear the screen when you want to focus on you. When you've shown a PowerPoint presentation, a slide, make sure that you have a blank slide after that. So you'll press the button, it'll go to a blank slide, then all the attention comes back to you, and then maybe your next slide comes 3 minutes into your speech. Then you can press the button and your new slide appears. We never want to leave a slide up while you're talking because your audience will fixate on that instead of you. Be familiar with the slide order to know which slide is coming up next. Nothing damages your credibility more than to put a slide up that you weren't expecting or that you forgot about, and you start fumbling and trying to, explain it. Limit moving text. Our little comedy routine illustrated that really nicely. So your limit, don't have things, spinning and moving around. Your text talks about Guy Kawasaki's 10-20-30 rule. Make sure you review that. Strategies for using your presentational aids. Before your speech, determine the information that you want to present. Don't let excessive presentational aids distract from the speech. Only create a presentational aid when it is necessary to clarify and enhance a message. Just don't use PowerPoint for the sake of using PowerPoint. Make PowerPoint an enhancement to your speech, not the speech unto itself. Select the appropriate type of aid. Make sure you have the time, the research, and the expertise. If you're going to use PowerPoint, make sure you're using it effectively. Ensure the correct sizing. Test in an actual speech environment. See if you can pull up a PowerPoint slide in a classroom and see if it's going to be large enough for you to use. If you've been asked to speak at a PTA meeting or an audience, see if they have a PowerPoint presentation you can go in and kind of test out. Before the speech, ensure your information is communicated clearly. Don't let excessive special effects confuse the audience. Construct aids that look professional. Take time to do it right. If you can't do it right, get help. Practice using those presentational aids. When you get up to deliver your speech, your presentational aid should be as smooth as the rest of your speech. During the speech, display the aids only when they're appropriate. Conceal them when they're done. So again, always have a blank slide. Reveal it, then another blank slide. Talk to your audience, not the presentational aids. Your audience should be able to read your presentational aids so you don't have to read back to them. Refer to the presentational aids. They can double as your speaking notes. If you've got nice bullet points, you can kind of refer to a bullet point and then expand on that with your language and your words. And they make sure you're maintaining a connection with your aids. Don't just put a visual aid up and let your audience process it. You should have to talk about the presentational aid. It should be you should have to interact with that. Keep your presentation in view until your point is made. Don't just put the PowerPoint slide up and then go to a blank screen and then start to explain it. Explain it while it's up. I always say avoid handouts. If you're going to use handouts, only give them out after your speech. If you've handed out a handout, or if it's absolutely essential, wait to hand them out until you're actually ready to talk about the handout. As we know, an audience, when they get a handout at the beginning of your speech, but you don't get to that handout until 10 minutes into your speech, your audience has already read it. They're disconnecting from you and looking at the handouts. You want to always control that information. So notice I'm done with my PowerPoint slide. It's a blank slide now. So this is what you would do in the classroom. So again, I hope this helps. I'm going to have another video presentation talking about the requirements for using presentational aids in your speeches. Make sure you view that. Again, if you have any questions, please email or contact me. I hope this was a helpful presentation. Always go back to the book, the chapter 14 on presentational aids. Thanks for watching and listening.